Hi Rob, please we are live now, so we can start.
Thank you. A warm welcome to everyone. Folks are still coming in from the waiting room, so we will give another minute or so for people to join, and then we will start. Hello, Euphemia. Nice that you could join us. We'll be starting in just a minute.
Jimmy, Stephanie me. They come in a meeting. Stephanie, what you get? Oh.
Euphemia, can I ask you to mute, please? Okay, a warm welcome to everyone. Welcome to this webinar on credit ratings and the International Development Cooperation System. My name is Rob Floyd. I'm a director at the African Center for Economic Transformation. We are a policy institute in Accra, Ghana, but working across the continent. It's my pleasure to be collaborating with UNDP, Africa Bureau, and AfriCatalyst on the Credit Rating Initiative. My colleague Jacob Assa from UNDP will say a bit more about that initiative. But I think this webinar is coming in at a particularly important time. The Finance for Development Conference 4 just concluded a couple of days ago. It addressed credit ratings in the context of global financial architecture reform, as well as a very broad range of topics such as debt, domestic resource mobilization, taxation, climate, and trade. Just a few housekeeping points before we get started. This is an open webinar and it will be recorded. So it is not Chatham House rules as ACET sometimes does. We do have simultaneous interpretation, French to English. You should see at the bottom of your screen a globe. If you click on that, you can choose the language that you would like to hear the webinar in. We will be taking questions towards the end, so there is a Q&A function. If you can kindly put your questions in the Q&A and indicate particularly if there's a individual, one of our panelists or discussant that you would like to hear from in particular. I'm going to do a quick round of introductions. We will be having some opening remarks from Jacob Assa. Jacob is the senior economist and strategic advisor in the Africa Bureau at the UNDP in New York. Then we will hear from Sherry Spiegel. Sherry is the director for financing for sustainable development at Endesa. And we are extraordinarily happy to have Sherry with us. She was the driving force behind the Finance for Development Conference in Seville. You and your team must be exhausted, so I greatly appreciate you making the time. Then we have three discussants. We'll hear from Abid Mzee, who is the senior economist at the Debt Management Division at the Ministry of Finance in Tanzania. We have Euphemia Sven-Monmia, who's the Director of Financial Markets from the Central Bank of Liberia. We have Fabrice Toka, who's the Executive Director of CCS Advisory and a member of the Africa Credit Ratings Initiative Concilium. And then our colleague Dauda Sembene, the CEO of AfriCatalyst, will give some summarizing remarks and close us out. We thank you all for making the time to join us. I see we have 79 participants who have joined, so that's a great number to have with us, and we look forward to a very good conversation. So let's kick things off. Jacob, if you can give a little bit of background on the Africa Credit Ratings Initiative, maybe some of the engagements that we've done with African governments to date, just to set the stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob, and thank you for ACET for hosting and organizing this webinar. This webinar is part of a series of events that we include in the community of practice on credit ratings. This is done with our partners, first and foremost, ACET and AfriCatalyst, but also ECA and APRM. Now, why are we talking about credit ratings and development? It might sound strange because credit ratings are normally perceived to be a financial issue, not a development issue. If you think about the history of development financing in the last 4 decades, you can see a large and considerable shift away from concessional financing and aid and multilateral support to market-based financing, such as lending and FDI. And when you move towards market lending and borrowing, countries need a mechanism to signal their creditworthiness. And one of those mechanisms is credit ratings. It's not the only one. In many cases, investors look at other metrics and do their own research. But especially in the case of Africa, where there's a dearth of information and data, credit ratings often act as a signaling mechanism. So if you have a good credit rating, you can attract a lot of capital at low rates and vice versa. Now, most of the debate in the past few years has been about bias in credit ratings. But we at UNDP and with our partners decided to take a different approach and not look at whether or not the methodologies are biased or appropriate. We realized there's a capacity gap within African countries. Many countries are not familiar with how to engage with rating agencies, with their methodologies, with the process. So we provide several services and tools to African countries to learn about this. First, we have an online platform, the Africa Credit Ratings Resource Platform, with a wealth of information on methodologies, data, and processes related to credit ratings. Secondly, we have this community of practice where you have webinars and podcasts and workshops that countries can use to learn more about how to prepare for this very important process. And thirdly, we deploy a group of experts that we call the Concilium. These are former S&P, Moody's, and Fitch ratings analysts that now work on behalf of our initiative and advise governments directly on how they need to prepare, what they need to do to communicate their story better, and how to ideally optimize their credit ratings so they can have greater access to financing for development. So this is where we are, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Jacob. Greatly appreciated. And I mean, I think the focus of the initiative on how to be supportive and constructive as opposed to looking at negative aspects of the international system is a very important one in this context. I will next go to Sherry Spiegel. As I mentioned, Sherry is the director at Endesa. And I don't know if you're just back from Seville or you're still there. But could you give us a little bit of background on the Finance for Development Conference itself and some of the key outcomes and directions? And needless to say, it was a particularly complex period in global development history. and kind of where the world is going on global financial architecture reforms more broadly, but then also importantly, the discussion in Seville among stakeholders on credit ratings and the role of credit rating agencies and kind of where some of the outcomes and the outcome document is pointing us and where you see things going in the future in this context. Thank you, Sherry.
Great. Thanks so much. And thanks for having me here. You're right. Just back. Actually, I came back over the weekend. So I've already been back at work it's my third day, but it's, back at work in New York, but it's, yeah, we're all pretty exhausted here. And the process, I don't know how many of you were there, if any of you, and how much you know about this process. FFD is a process that started in 2002, and the last one was in Addis Ababa with the Monterey Consensus. The last one previously was in 2015 in Addis Ababa, the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, that in a sense, at that point was thinking about how do you finance, really linking it to the SDGs. And so this was now looking at updating that agenda to think through, a lot hadn't been implemented. We'd actually gone backwards in financing the SDGs. And what has to be done? What should the new framework look like? An updated framework in the current context to also both to reaffirm Addis, but to say what didn't happen, how do we make it happen, and what else do we need? We had 4 co-facilitators in the negotiations here in New York: Mexico, Nepal, Norway, and Zambia, and they were really led the process. We as a secretariat supported them in that process. And of course, Spain was the host of the conference. I would say that the conference was, I would say surprisingly, though, by the time we went, we weren't that surprised, but surprisingly hopeful. So it's a really, really challenging environment, as you know, what's happening in trade, aid cuts, aid announced, and as we were going through the process, there were some views that while with all of this happening, this is the wrong time to have a conference, but I think the view at the end was it's the right time to have a conference. The outcome document was agreed by consensus. Right before it was agreed in New York, the US disassociated from the process. So they were there through the very last negotiation, but they walked out right before it was gavelled in. So it was an agreement with everybody, consensus, though one country was missing from that consensus. But I think that when we went to Sevilla, the issue was on implementation. That was the main focus last week. There in the document, there are what we think of as 3 strategic steps. One is investment, which includes domestic resource mobilization, the role of both the public and private investments. So really a big emphasis on the role of public development banks, not just the MDBs, the multilateral development banks, but also public development banks in national development banks and other types of national public development banks. The Finance and Commons Summit, which brings together all of the development banks globally, came out of Addis, the Addis negotiations, and not the negotiations, but out of that discussion. And so there is a real link in this agenda between public investment as well, and then as well as private investment, and how do we get it right? Because we know since 2015, the goals and the expectations for private investment and blended finance have not paid out. And so there was have not lived up to expectations even close. So there was a real emphasis on thinking that through. It's not a billions to trillions agenda. The trillions are important, but what's really important is development impact and how do we ensure that resources go where they're needed. So the second area is debt. Under debt, there are really 4 issues, and I'm not going to spend too much time going into this, but one is on prevention, one is on second is lowering the cost of capital. The third, and that includes debt swaps and debt buybacks and those types of instruments, as well as ratings, which I'll get to in a second. The third is when a country does default, then the restructuring architecture, which we know it doesn't work as well as countries want, and as many say is broken. That's the common framework, but also one of the outcomes is to have a new process on debt at the UN, as well amongst UN member states, as well as a debtors club. And then finally, the 4th area is this issue of both debt sustainability analyses by the IMF, World Bank, and credit ratings. And so they are cross-cutting across all of those 3 elements, but particularly in many ways for lowering the cost of capital. So I'll get to that in a second. The third big area is international financial architecture reform. That includes the global financial safety net, but an SDR, sovereign special drawing right issues. There are quite a few ideas and commitments there to encourage the IMF to take on. as well as questions on governance issues and a call for increasing basic voting rights, basic votes, et cetera. So those are the three big areas: investment, steps, and you can see the logo has 3 steps: investment, debt, and architecture reform. Now, ratings come across particularly, well, it's across all 3 of those, and particularly under debt and systemic issues, is where there was actually quite a bit of ratings in the negotiations and quite a few events with rating agencies in Sevilla itself. I would say that one of the really, we in the UN and in DESA, we've been working with ratings for years, actually, going back to 2013, I think was the first meeting with rating agencies. This was the first time, though, since those early days that we had all the rating agencies really engaging and really being part of the conversation. And one of the outcomes in the outcome document, the Sevilla commitment, is to have an ECOSOC meeting with rating agencies and member states to have a conversation. So we'll definitely want to work with all of you to really make that a meaningful conversation. So in terms of, maybe it's worth mentioning something about 2013 to 2014, because that was following the financial crisis. And the focus at the time was on misratings of structured products. And arguably, or not even arguably, I think it's fairly well agreed that ratings were bad ratings were a big part of the financial crisis. So mispricing on mortgage-backed securities that had subprime mortgages they were just misrated. And I was actually investing at the time. And the investors all knew this, right? So a bunch of investors knew this. So that's why everybody was arbitraging this big, it was called the trade of the century at the time. And there was this knowledge that the misratings were a big part of the crisis. And so the discussions then were focused on issues with rating, with the business models of ratings. So non-competitive markets, you have a natural oligopoly sort of, because for a rating agency to become big enough to have an impact, it needs to have confidence in it and people have to use it. And how do you get there? And that's why it's very hard for new rating agencies to come in, because how do you build that reputation to be trusted? And then it's sort of a cycle. There are conflicts of interests. The issuer pays for the rating, and so there's issues with that. There are questions of mechanistic reliance on ratings. That's not the fault of the rating agencies, but in regulations use ratings. There was an effort to reduce that prior to the 2013 to the 2009 crisis. It didn't work very well because some of the banks began to manipulate the models they were using to replace ratings in regulation and capital requirements. And the result was return to ratings because we don't have anything else. So there's this question of how do you actually have a less mechanistic reliance on ratings? It's not so easy. And then this question of how do you regulate ratings? So, and those issues are still in the outcome document. The European Union had some regulation more than others, Dodd-Frank in the US, but that was rolled back. And so the outcome document actually relies on the European Union language and talks about having better regulation of ratings. But the truth is relatively little happened to regulate ratings since then. There's some increase in transparency. As I said, there's been some efforts. And we didn't see an increase in numbers. We didn't see the market mechanisms change. And that was after ratings arguably caused the crisis, the global financial crisis. So I think that when we think about all these big changes we expect, it's very hard to get some of these changes to happen. Now, that's just to give you some history of where we are. It's even more complicated with sovereign ratings than corporate ratings. So now we're focusing on ratings of governments. And here under corporate ratings, there's the reason that they messed up with that there were challenges with subprime mortgages was that they didn't have good history of data on subprime mortgages. So they use regular mortgages for the data. In corporates, they have a lot of data, but these are very data-driven ratings. Under sovereigns, there's a lot more judgment that comes into it. And so there's a data-driven component based on the ability to repay debt. but there's also this discretionary component that's based on the credit analysts and a credit rating agency committee. There are usually now, very interestingly, last week in Sevilla, and I didn't have enough time. I was running around to so many meetings to hear all these conversations, but some of the ratings were announced, agencies announced that they're actually making some changes to their modeling and their thinking. So that's really interesting. So what I'm about to say is, and it's also obviously the pressure that's coming from all of us and from all of you that's making this happen. So that's just already shows how the world coming together can actually improve some of some of the issues that are being focused on. But historically, there were things like institutional and governance. You know, how much of that is rules and judgment? That's mostly judgment. There are questions of economics. That's the second factor in the building blocks for sovereign rating. That's mostly rules, but not all completely. There are questions of monetary issues, which are actually, again, the credibility of monetary policy, which again are very judgment oriented in some sense. So there are a lot of factors, and the 5 factors of governance and institutional arrangements, economic, external issues like currency, status, fiscal, and monetary. Those are the 5 main building blocks. There was enormous space for judgment. So just to say that this becomes even more complicated. Now, in terms of what came out of, I'm going to speed up so that I don't spend too much time just me talking, but in terms of what came out of last week in Sevilla and the outcome document itself. So the first is just an acknowledgement that that some countries have very high risk premiums, including even higher than their peers, despite similar risk ratings. And that's not necessarily, that's a market question in some sense. So there are big issues that are, what is the fault of the ratings and what is the fault of markets? They're very interlinked. And then one of the calls was for capacity building to enable entities to engage better with both financial market actors as well as credit rating agencies. So really hats off to your initiative with UNDP and ACET to do this. I think there's actually a call for this in the outcome, and I'm glad to see it's already happening. And in terms of other recommendations, the first is to enhance transparency and update rating methodologies to be more long-term oriented. So that when you think initially when we started having these discussions, again, these were many years back, even before the COVID crisis, people, one of the responses was, well, how can you predict long term? And the response to that is that ratings shouldn't be about predictions. So when I was managing money, my first boss told me that I'm ahead of the game if I'm right 60% of the time. But I'm beating all my competitors. And that's okay. I have a portfolio approach, so I don't have to be right all the time. I just need to be right more often than not. But the ratings, we expect them to be right all the time. And the cost, if they have any impact at all, which there's a question about that, but if they do, and what their impact is, then they get it wrong. It costs people. It costs, countries, it costs the people living in that country. So there is a real, it's the impact of, so they shouldn't be guessing, right? They shouldn't be using it's not about being right or wrong. They should be using, one thought is they should be looking at scenario-based long analyses to understand long-term ratings. And under different shocks and different scenarios, how well will this country respond to those shocks and scenarios, rather than trying to predict the future. So one of the calls is to have long-term scenario-based analysis. A second is to publish model-based assessments and then show the qualitative overlay, to be very transparent about what part is the qualitative part. Now, that's not so easy because they don't separate these very well yet, but that's one of the calls. A third, and I'm sure you've all been part of this discussion, is if we're having long-term, you can't look at the impact of investments on ratings and the positive benefits from investments in resilience or investments in long-term productivity if you don't have a long-term rating. But if you have a long-term rating, right now they don't look at that. They look at it's almost like if you look at a company, you always look at where the money's going, where are the assets and the liabilities. For ratings and sovereigns, we just look at the income, we just look at the flows. So this question of how do you think about the asset side and what the positive impact of investments is missing. And the IMF, for example, is now trying to work on incorporating that into their debt sustainability analysis. And so there's also a call to bring that into ratings, as well as the impact of SDGs and both the risks and the benefits. Another piece is to positively reflect long-term debt sustainability benefits of voluntary debt restructurings. This became a big issue in DSSI, was that DSSI would help, the private sector wasn't involved, that became clear from the beginning. It would help countries. If you join, it actually helps you be able to repay your creditors, and yet there was a risk of being penalized for that. That was the debt suspension sustainability initiative of the G20 that happened during COVID. And the same thing with debt swaps. If you do a voluntary debt swap, it helps your ability to repay creditors. You shouldn't be penalized for that in your ratings as if you defaulted. And then finally, there's a call to increase dialogue of credit rating agencies with the public sector. Again, your work is really excellent for that with capacity development. And there's also this new ECOSOC meeting and dialogue among member states. So that's basically what's there. The final question is always comes up in these discussions is, should we have public rating agencies? And the question there on public rating agencies, as I said, is, would they be trusted? And the question, and then the second follow-up question is, how do you make them trusted? So it's not a question of, well, they won't be trusted, so let's not do it. I think it's a question of, if you're going to consider it, how do you do it right? And to do it right, and this is something where I'm thinking of the outcome welcomes the establishment of the Africa Credit Rating Agency and looks forward to its operation. And the question I think to be thought about is, how do you build trust? And how do you build that reputation? And I think the answer is very transparent methodologies that you publish on your website and make it very clear. And then if you do have a model-based component, isn't it interesting to compare that to the rating agencies? If we can have a pure model-based idea, if they're not going to publish model-based versus discretion, someone else can publish that, and then we can see where their perceptions are. So I'm going to stop there. Sorry if I talked for quite a while. I just realized I did. Sorry for that. And I'm very much looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Sherry. No apologies needed at all. That was all fabulous. And particularly, I think, positioning this conversation going back as far as 2013 was also quite important. And thanks for outlining, some of the kind of the key factors around what goes into ratings, and also thanks for bringing in your own experience. Yes, if any of us could be successful 60% of the time in the market, we would all be rich, right? And I know our discussants will have some thoughts on different things you mentioned, particularly the role of the markets versus the rating agencies, where essentially at the end of the day, of course, it's the markets that determined the interest rates. And then I think, outlining the calls that were made in Seville regarding credit ratings was very clear. Let's go now to our discussants. I'm first going to go to Abid Mzee, as I mentioned, a senior economist at the Debt Management Division at the Ministry of Finance of Tanzania. Abid, Tanzania actually got its first sovereign credit rating in 2018, but with a negative outlook. And that was upgraded in 2022 by Moody's to positive. In June 2023, Fitch came out with a B+ rating. And in 2024, Moody's raised Tanzania's rating back to B1 with a stable outlook. What has been, can you give us a bit of insight into the government of Tanzania's engagement with Moody's and Fitch during this period? And what do you see as the biggest challenges in these relationships between a government in Africa and the credit rating agencies? And just responding to the points that Sherry outlined here, which of these actions or reforms do you think would be most important in the context of Tanzania and its relationship with credit rating agencies? Abid, over to you.
Thank you so much, Rob, and thank you so much, Sherry, for the insights.
Turn on your camera if you have bandwidth, Abid. There we go. That's wonderful.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Robbie. Yeah. So I was saying thank you so much, Sherry, for the insights. For some of us who were not in Seville to attend the Finance for Development event. So it's such an insight that you gave us for a short period of time, and it will be great if you share some maybe publications or any documents that as you have mentioned, so that to get more insights on our own time. Thank you so much. After that, I would also like to put forward appreciations to the African Center for Economic Transformations and UNDP and AfriCatalyst to invite us again to this webinar. As Jacob was said that we have several times met here in Dodoma for the first country workshop on credit rating. And later on, we met in Addis Ababa for the first regional workshop for the Eastern countries, and then recently in Abidjan. So this workshop have been so much fruitful for us, and it keeps improving our engagement with rating agencies, and hopefully it keeps coming and gets more insights from other stakeholders elsewhere in the world. So getting back to Rob's questions, for us, Tanzania, as you said, been upgraded last year, and that shows very much indeed the good engagement we have with the rating agencies, with Moody's and Fitch. As you all know, that Tanzania right now we have a good score compared to the
Abid, can you hear us? At least from my side, you're frozen.
the
Abid, I'm sorry, you're frozen. Maybe turn. Yeah, there you go. Did we lose him completely? I believe we did. Okay, hopefully he will be able to reconnect. But let's continue. So let me just pivot a bit to Euphemia. Euphemia is the Director for Financial Markets at the Central Bank of Liberia. As you heard, Euphemia, the FFD focused on a wide range of global financial architecture reforms. Now, looking at Liberia's economy, of course, it struggled for a number of years, due in part to the Ebola outbreak and policy uncertainties and protests in 2019. Then, of course, COVID, the COVID pandemic. But since 2021, it's actually been a pretty strong economic rebound, with economic expansion about 5% and inflation down to 13% this year, I believe. At the same time, government spends about 12% of all revenues on debt service. So thinking about the global financial architecture reforms that Sherry emphasized, what do you think would be the most important from Liberia's perspective to get progress on those reforms, coupled at the same time with improvements in the credit ratings, and give us some insight why?
Thank you, Rob, for the question, and thanks to ACET for the opportunity to contribute to this important dialogue today. You're right. Indeed, Liberia's economy have seen a commendable rebound since 2021. There has been several improvements along several economic indicators, as you rightly said. We had inflation at around 13%. We're fighting to get it down to single digit before the end of the year due to several changes as well relative to monetary policy here at the central bank. But you did mention the burden of debt service, and it is currently consuming, around 12% of government revenues. So this remains a constraint, on our fiscal space and looking at development financing as well. So in this context, while we're looking at credit rating and the importance or criticality of its reform, we think that there are other global financial architecture reforms that are equally, if not more important for Liberia's long-term resilience and fiscal sustainability. And I would just like to highlight few, right, in particular. So from our side, we're looking at mobilization of domestic public resources. And there are several efforts that we think, must be made. The country as in different institutions are also looking at these things, and there are several efforts that are being made along those lines, which, are in support of the FFD4's recent agreements and decisions. And so one of them we're looking at is strengthening Liberia's tax systems, right? So in Liberia, we currently have an integrated tax administration system, and the essence of that is to actually ensure that we have an online tax system that eases the processing and payments of tax by taxpayers. And so it's about improving the entire tax system, which is one of those indicators that you're looking at as well. Additionally, the Revenue Authority also is set to roll out significant tax reforms. And the essence of that, one of them is transitioning from goods and service tax to value-added tax systems, and increasing also the tax percentage to raise domestic revenue to support national development initiatives. We've seen one of the ways that we can reduce the debt service to revenue is if we can increase revenue, right? So if our debt portfolio is what it is and we have to make these payments, by increasing domestic revenues, we can also improve, the percentage of debt service to revenue. Another thing that we're doing, which is also in line with some of the infrastructure reforms that you talk about, and is looking at strengthening public financial management systems. And there has been several reforms where by the public financial management team, where they're looking at different instruments to improve transparency. They're looking at revenue sharing regulations, for example, for local accountability, for fiscal decentralization. And we think that these are essential also if we must attract concessional or private finance. People need to know that you're accountable and you're responsible government. Additionally, we're looking to promote investment in sustainable development and to be able to build our domestic financial and capital markets as well. There has been several initiatives with the central bank, as the case may be, to build the domestic and financial markets. And we've been working from the central bank side with the Ministry of Finance along these lines, where we're looking at developing the domestic debt market, where we're looking at also, I think Shari spoke about the debt sustainability when she was talking with World Bank and the IMF. Liberia recently, just last week, we sent someone from Financial Markets Department and the debt management unit at the Ministry of Finance to benefit from that World Bank sponsored training on debt sustainability. And we think that this will help us also in improving the assessment, of debt sustainability as we work towards developing medium-term debt management strategy. We've also been working along with the Ministry of Finance to align the annual borrowing plan with the medium-term debt management strategy, and that's for information and transparency in the domestic market as well, and also to ensure integration into national budget. I know that the reforms that you're looking at also talk about having national financial, national integrated financing programs. And so it's about how do we align domestic debt resource mobilization into national budget, as well. And that helps us with the amount of debt that we can take up. We also have several projects running with African Development Bank, Capital Markets Development Trust Funds, where they're sponsoring assessment of our capital markets, assessment of our debt market. We have roadmaps now that we should be looking at as part of our reform to kind of strengthen, the domestic and capital markets as well along these lines. Also under domestic resource mobilization, we're working with the African Development Bank as well for a pension sector project in Liberia. And And the essence is to be able to develop the pension sector in Liberia. And that will help us to pool private sector resources that will help, support long-term infrastructure projects in the country as well. We're looking at how we can also scale up concessional financing and see how we can tailor programs for blended finance and all that. As you know, Liberia is a low-income country, but not only that, we're a climate vulnerable country as well. And so there's need for low cost, high impact kind of financing. And we're aware that traditional finance models are very expensive, loan heavy and expensive. And with where we stand relative to our fiscal capacity to actually absorb costly debt, we can say that it's good for us to look at the different kinds of financing that we get involved in, that we are taking those kinds of blended finance or concessional finance that the country or the fiscal space can be able to, accept and adjust. And we think that this is important because it will help us to raise low cost funding that will help, with investment in climate resilient infrastructure, health, education, and these kinds of projects within our country. Now, countries like mine have not been rated by credit rating companies, right, by credit rating agencies. And there is basically this phobia given the experience of about 32 other countries in Africa now that have been rated with non-investment grades. So compared to just 2 that have investment grades. And so we think with this phobia, right, from our perspective, Liberia, in parallel to the credit rating reforms, must reflect the realities of countries like mine. Ratings should account for structural reforms, long-term investment in human capital, resilience, building efforts of our countries. Or else, if we do get involved with credit rating companies, the fear is that they could undermine the development progress and cause higher cost of funding than we actually want to get if we were to be rated by credit rating companies. And that's why we're happy for the support from we support what the FFD4 is looking towards reforming or having this reform for the methodologies. So being more transparent in what they do, being more forward-looking. We think that this is good. So in conclusion, I would just like to say that Liberia would prefer a holistic reform agenda. We think that it's essential, not just running for credit rating, but looking at, everything in its totality. And this will help to strengthen our domestic resource mobilization, support fair debt treatment, and unlock opportunities for us as well. And that's why we consider the recent UNDP Africa Catalyst sponsored consultation on sovereign credit rating. We thought that that was very beneficial. I personally was a part of that training, and we think that it helped us to set the stage to pursue these reforms that we're looking at, and even more in tandem to ensure that countries like ours are not left behind, in the global financial system. And we are also set for when we engage credit rating agencies to have better outcome, than perhaps what other countries have, or what we would have had we not prepared before meeting with credit rating agencies. So thank you again, Rob, for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. If we have time, I'd actually like to come back to, not right now, but like to come back to regarding any conversations you're currently having and kind of how the rating agencies are responding to these positions to have a longer term view and so forth. But let me go first before we come back to you. Let me go back to Ebaid. You dropped off, but hopefully we have you back. So if you can continue where you dropped off, that would be great.
Thank you so much, Rob, and allow me to continue without videoing myself. And I think that's the problem of the network right here. Yeah, so that's I was saying our relationship with rating agencies. It's good, and we hope we'll continue to be so. But also that's the general picture on our side. But I will tell you when we discuss with with these rating agencies, you will have two faces. At some point, you will see that a relationship you have with them, it is good, but at some point also, you will find yourself having some sort of misunderstanding on some areas when you have a deep discussion, and at the end of the day, we'll find out that there is some different perceptions on certain items. So, for instance, generally, I would say the relationship, it depends with policy perspectives. So when the government takes the policy, the rating analysts think that will enhance growth. But at the end of the day, it will be great for both of you. But if that goes the opposite side, that's discussions will be deep, and at the end of the day, you will find out the credit opinion, which have contained some stories which is not good for your country. For instance, for instance, here in Tanzania, most of the time when we discuss about the economic strength of our country as well as fiscal and monetary issues, we'll find ourselves having a good discussions because of the numbers that we have, the policy direction, the fiscal conservative approach that we are taking, having a deficit of less than 3% compared to our regional peers, having a moderate level of debt. Our cost of servicing debt, it's moderate because of about 2/3 of our debt is on concessional terms. So when you have the stories like that, which of course have the same perception for both sides going forward in terms of fiscal management, the relationship with these rating agencies will continue to be good and hopefully will improve your scores going forward. But when you have, I would say, a different perspective on some items, like I would mention one, like let's say the governance. Shari here was mentioned, the subjectivity or the biasness of this rating analyst on the methodology. So when you discuss about the governance and for whatever reason, they think that the actions that have been taken by the government for some reason does not enhance the governance of the democracy. You'll see having a credit opinions which is not in your favor of your country. But at the same time, that policy directions could be that the government thinks doing that directions would lead our country having a good governance depending on the nature of our population and so forth and so on. So when having the different perspective on certain items, you will find out yourself having a bad relationship with these rating agencies, and at the end of the day, publishing a credit opinions which gives out some sort of credit weaknesses of your country. So because of that, most of the time it's kind of difficult to balance of the two between the decision makers here at the government, as well as making sure that you do things that do things that rating agencies will make them to improve your grade going forward. So that situation gives you to a situation that it will be hard to implement or to recommend to the decision makers a policy which at the end of the day will improve rating, but that policy directions would not sink in well with the decision makers. So for me, I would say so far for the past 2 years that we've been engaging with the rating agencies, that's the big challenge to manage between the two. But generally, as far as Tanzania is concerned, in the rating agencies and the movie and the way we move and we see ourselves, it's a good relationship. Going back to the points of Shari in terms of reforms that would at least enhance the credit rating or the credit narrative, it's always the same thing, being transparency. If you want to be useful to avoid this misunderstanding between countries, authorities, and the rating agencies. As much as we can, let's reduce the subjectivity on the methodology. So, like right now, I think the Fitch or Moody's, they fetch all the information concerning governance and institutions from the World Bank, from this, what is called the country policy and institutional assessments. And it doesn't care about what happened on the discussions when the country authority discussed with the World Bank. At the end of the day, the World Bank, they are the final, they're putting the final call on the numbers on the country policy and institutional assessments, which at the end of the day has been fetched by these rating agencies and come out with the scorecard. So having also discussions on that end would at least put the authorities on a comfort zone, having that having in mind that we also discussed and putting forward our insights on how we think we are doing our policies to enhance democracy as well as governance, as well as other issues concerning the institutional capacity, institutional frameworks are concerned. So I would say if we move along those lines together with the economics of our countries, have the fiscal management, the economic strength, resilience, and sustainability, as well as making sure that our external sector are well put in terms of currency stability. We believe that going forward, we will really improve our scorecard like other countries in Europe or elsewhere in the world. Thank you so much, Rob.
Thank you, Abid. Great insights, and I particularly like your reference to stories, because so much of this, I mean, as Sherry noted, I mean, there's a data-driven part, but then also a judgment or a perspective-driven part, which is really around a narrative, right? And then what is the story that is told. Let's move on now to Fabrice. But before that, I just want to encourage everyone to please put your questions in the Q&A box. You should see a box at the bottom of your screen. Just click on that and type in your questions for our panelists. Fabrice, I want to come to you next. You've been in the credit rating business for some time, both with Fitch and GCR, and now as executive director of CCS. The world is grappling with a new international development cooperation reality, which Sherry mentioned, with reductions in aid, of fragmentation, of multilateralism, the rise of non-traditional actors or lenders, if you will. And I see one of the questions that someone has put in is about China. But given this kind of new space, what do you think, and the reforms and direction of travel that is coming out of Seville, the FFD, what do you think is the most important things that African countries can do to help ensure, I would say, fair but also positive credit ratings, or put another way, what do they need to do differently, and particularly in this current global context?
Sorry guys, I'm in transit, so if I lose you, I'll dial back. No, thank you, Rob. Thank you for having me. Before, I know we're talking about rating agencies, but maybe I'll make some general comments to say, I think the outcome of Sevilla tells us that there are a lot of things that we need to consider in addition to rating agencies. The conversation was around investments, debt. So to me, there's a whole, it's a holistic approach to debt, right? Debt burden is the quantum of debt and the cost. So maybe just on the burden itself, on the quantum, there's a discussion that we need to have on public investment decisions. What's the governance around that? How do we decide to take on debt? Okay. What sort of governance transparency we want to have around the fiscal position of the government. We talked about investment in civilian. But then maybe there's a question around what sort of macro policies do we need to have in place to make that debt sustainable, to improve the business environment so that we can bring in investment, be it foreign FDIs, foreign direct investment, or promote internal economic activity. They are, and I like what Euphemia said about Liberia. There are questions also around revenue mobilization by the government. What can we do to raise revenue that we need to support the debt service and make it more sustainable? All right. So I think there's a bigger and wider conversation that needs to take place. And when it comes to cost, the cost is not only about the rating itself. There are considerations around the mix of your debt. We talked about domestic capital. That's one way, one thing that we could consider in terms of managing debt better for African countries. We know that FX is actually at times more expensive than the rate itself, right? FX movements. Are there things that we need to consider around the duration mix, the maturity profile of the debt, all those things that we need to think about now so that we can do better or more with less resources available from the concessional windows or from ODA from countries on a bilateral basis. But as you said, Rob, there's been a shift. Okay, so countries have to attract more market-based capital, and often to do that you need a rating. African countries got into conversation with rating agencies around 2003. And 22 years later, I think the first thing that we need to emphasize today is there seems to still be a need for education. We need to understand the rating process. We need to understand what ratings mean. We need to understand how rating agencies operate. Okay, so it may sound basic, but I think that is actually foundational for African countries, because that would give them two things: the basis to have constructive criticism to the rating agencies by understanding the products and the process better, but more urgently, maybe give them a way to understand the rules and therefore optimize the outcome, if I may say that in these terms, a way to understand the rules and play the game to get the best outcome possible. You may, I think, most officials are at the loss for positive words when it comes to rating agencies. It's not an African problem, right? It's everywhere. Cherie talked about things that are being considered: a public rating agency, different ways of looking at long-term investment, etc. I think a lot of those conversations would benefit from, first, a firm understanding of what ratings are meant to be measuring, and how rating agencies operate. How people use them sometimes may be different from what rating agencies intend them to be. So it's important to understand that. And while those conversations are important, useful, and as Cherie said, some rating agencies are incorporating some changes. There are discussions around ESG, how to take that better into consideration, etc. I think for the time being, what countries need to really focus on is, how do I prepare myself to engage the best way possible with rating agencies by understanding the rating process, understanding the rating products themselves, being prepared to tell my story, and be prepared to tell my story with the relevant data to support that story, essentially. The conversations that we're having around, bias, no bias, and changes that we want to see a rating agency adopt to some extent, they're a bit longer term than the needs that the countries have. The needs are fairly immediate, and in the short run, we would think that the capacity building element, the training, the understanding, is actually where a good deal of the effort should go for those countries. And the UNDP initiative is one way, to address that need for capacity building. But there are other ways to get help, to get advisors, etc., on the continent or elsewhere. But I think that it's very important to have a clear understanding of the rating agencies and the sovereign ratings themselves. And sometimes we keep hearing things like the methodologies are not transparent, etc. I'm not sure that's true. They are publicly available. They are on the website. The rating agencies even tell you what their scoring model produces. They'll tell you what the outcome is and what adjustments they've made to that outcome to get to the rating. So there's been a lot of effort to become more transparent. I think countries need to invest in understanding those methodologies for themselves much better than they do right now, so that they can have they can come prepared and have the sort of robust conversations that they need to have with rating agencies to advance their own stories. And that needs to be backed up by data. And I think we've mentioned data before on this call, is that at the end of the day, you need to be able to factually show or demonstrate what you're saying, and that's where data is important. Then the interpretation might be open to some subjectivity, but at least have the core data to support the credit story that you're telling. So that would be, for me, Rob, the main recommendation is to be prepared by investing time to understand the process, investing time to understand the rating agency, and take the time to really be prepared because it's about storytelling, as you said, but that story needs to be supported by evidence. I'll stop there. I'm sure there are questions for me.
No, that is very well put, and thank you very much. So let's go now to some Q&A. I have a couple of things to get us kicked off, and one is to Sherry, following directly from what Fabrice was just saying, and we didn't discuss it much earlier, but I saw the reference to this idea of a borrower forum or some type of platform for borrowing countries to come together. And I'm just wondering whether, in addition to and to complement and parallel with efforts such as the UNDP After Credit Rating Initiative, could you give us a little bit of insight on this borrower forum, if you can, if it's known, and whether there may be opportunities there to build on this work and to do some of this work that Fabrice was talking about around understanding on both sides and ensuring full information and so forth?
Sure. So I think it's still in the works. So it hasn't been, the details are being laid out. There's a coalition of countries that are really in the lead on this. Zambia and Egypt, I think, are leading on this. And I think there's a plan to have a first meeting in Zambia in the fall sometime. Spain is supporting it and is thinking of like a Sevilla Borrowers Club. I forget what the name is, but and yes, I think that some of the big issues that can come, that can take many different paths. One could include peer learning, certainly, and could include the question of learning from countries to learn from each other as to issues of debt sustainability analyses and credit ratings. You know, one of the ideas in the outcome document that is something we also are begun to think about is for countries to do their own DSAs, like to have their own ratings internally. And then if you do that, you can work both with the IMF and the World Bank on your DSAs and say, this is how we see it, also to negotiate with, to talk to rating agencies as well. So I think that that's one piece of it. There's also a call, an outcome, a UN member state driven process on debt at the UN, where it's meant to be part of that will be a discussion with creditors, including rating agencies, as well as the creditors, the IMF, the World Bank, and then private creditors, and the Paris Club is mentioned. So I think there are going to be many opportunities to both have debtor conversations amongst each other, to strengthen those conversations, and then to bring them to a conversation that's across different entities, including the meeting directly with rating agencies that will happen in ECOSOC. So I think, and we in the Secretariat are thinking about how we see all of this as one holistic process, not a million different new things, but that it's all part of the same bigger process.
Yeah, that's exactly why I noted that hopefully that we can have complementary initiatives that build upon each other. So thanks very much. So we'll certainly watch that space. I'll ask my colleagues, Mindy, Bio, and Maggie. I have not been able to follow all of the Q&A in the online. So if I'll ask you guys to come in and just pose a couple of the questions. But just before you do, there was a question specific, Euphemia, to you regarding, I think someone said that they thought you said that the library was not rated, and if that's the case, of how you have accessed the international capital markets.
Okay, yes, so definitely, like I said, Liberia has not been rated by any credit rating agency. And we haven't issued Eurobond or any of those sorts. Usually we source international funding through bilateral arrangements or concessional funding. So we haven't gone to the capital markets to issue Eurobonds or any of those sorts of bonds on the international capital markets.
Great, thanks for that clarification. But then it allows me to come back to the question I wanted to ask you earlier.
Okay.
Can you give us a bit of a sense of your, and if you're not, it's fine, but I assume you have engagement with the credit rating agencies, if not officially, then unofficially, and kind of as opposed to Tanzania that's been rated for a number of years. What's the nature of that conversation? Just if you give us a bit of insight, and as Shari noted, I mean, you know, that they're also thinking about changes that they can make. So it'd be interesting to hear your perspectives on that.
No, so we haven't had these direct engagements. What we've been doing internally is discussing internally some of the things that we may need to have in place to start those engagements. And so that's why I said that the UNDP AfriCatalyst, and I think ACET was also part of the core sponsors of the consultation, regional consultation that was held recently, kind of like help us to rethink some of the things that we're discussing to prepare us for those engagements. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much. Bio, could you come in with a question or two from the Q&A?
Sure. One of the questions I see here from Joanna Musime, while the methodology may not be perfect and judgments may be driven by distorted media stories, but again, I think in Africa, we're very good at penning strategies and policy reforms, but we never follow through with them. Some issues constantly raised by these rating agencies, we clearly can't dispute. Issues concerning institutional capacity and credibility, political stability and governance challenges, infrastructure challenges, high levels of indebtedness, and so on. So while we want to argue for better ratings, let's not forget that we also play a role in how we're rated. And so what are we doing about it? Because a good story not backed by results on the ground is only a story. So I guess it's a bit of a combination of a question and a comment, and addressed to everyone.
Well, thanks, Bayo. I'll first go to Abaid. I mean, you mentioned very eloquently in some areas you're aligned with the credit rating agencies and the narratives, and in some areas you're not. And here I want to relate this back to Fabrice's point about data. How do you, in those cases where a credit rating agency may say, we see a situation as more negative than what government's storyline is, how do you counter that with data? Or are there opportunities to counter that with data? And how do you do that?
Thank you, Rob. And it's true. It's true, as Fabrice was saying, as well as the stockholder from the chart, that of course we need to cement our stories with data, and that will also at least reduce some sort of discussion with rating agencies. But the challenge is that some information you cannot provide some for instance, the qualitative information concerning the governance, the world governance indicators, which they take upright from the World Bank database. So the way those indicators are prepared, it's not like the discussions that we have with the rating agencies. So there are some sort of question or discretions process that have been done with those institutions to get some information, and then they go out and publish those results. At some point, not even getting comments or feedback from the government, as we are doing on this solicited rating exercise. So because of that, at some point, it's hard to provide some data rather than provide some information. Like you can see right now, our country, we're not experienced any political stability. We never experienced that, even we are on the election year. So those are some kind of evidence that you can provide backed with the historical information that we have, because of the qualitative nature it has.
Thanks very much. A kind of a related question. I mean, maybe for you and for Fabrice. I see someone has put in about the countries have their own uniquenesses and advantages and challenges. I mean, this is about contextualization, and I know one of the challenges that is often noted is that the credit rating agencies have very few offices in Africa. I mean, mostly in South Africa, if they do exist, often with the ratings analysts flying in from London or Dubai, etc. And I mean, maybe this is less about governance, although it could be, but certainly there's issues such as the role of the informal economy and so forth that may not be captured sometimes. Abeda, how do you deal with those contextualized issues? And then Fabrice, I mean, this often comes up, and I've heard representatives from the credit rating agencies try to defend this, but do you think it's simply a financial decision, or are the markets just so small that it doesn't really matter to the agencies? And I'm not asking you to respond on behalf of the agencies, but kind of your insights into why we still have this situation. But Abaid, first to you.
Yeah, as you put it, Robbie, you put it right. Even our analysts for Fitch and Moody's, they are not here in Tanzania. So they just come here once a year, where we do the review in country, and then the other review, they're doing it virtually. So at some point, it's hard to even if you provide a lot of evidences to the rating analyst, it's a bit difficult because of the literature I would say he has from the countries, because the rating analysts read reports for the IMFs, and at some point the IMF reports produces informations which of course is it's not agreed by the government. At some point it happens. So what we do is just to provide data, informations, and which we believe that could at least change their perceptions on what we think we are putting forward. But as I said, at the end of the day, they are taking a final call, and at the end of the day, they are the one decide which things to put on the report and not to put. So for me, it's still, as Fabrice was put it, let's make an effort to those lands that we can improve. Like for the case of Tanzania right now, we of course, even if we have high rates of economic growth, our population growth is also high, so putting the low level of per capita income, which constrains our scorecard to be improving. So those lines, working on those numbers, which can easily be quantifiable, and at least will improve our scorecard going forward, rather than focus on the lines that we cannot tell, and at the end of the day we are on the back of the stage, just receiving what we get from the rating agencies. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Fabrice, do you have thoughts or reactions?
I'm not going to speak on behalf of rating agencies, as you said, Rob, but yeah, it's fair to say that rating agencies are, they run a business, so it has to make business sense for them to, to be in a given location. And it's also fair to say that they are currently underrepresented in Africa. And I'm glad to see that some rating agencies have indicated that they're looking to do more, to be more visible and more active in the market. Going back to the question of every country is specific and etc., it is true. But if you believe that the ratings are a form of uniform signal that you want market participants to use, it has to be standardized for it to make sense. If not, no one would know how to interpret the ratings, right? And that's part of the process. But again, the rules are known, and it's up to each country to know that, maybe I won't fare well on this indicator, therefore I need to apply myself a bit more, or I need to provide evidence to support that in other areas I'm doing better. And hopefully, there are different ways of getting to the same rating level. And I will be careful to say that would explain bias or anything of that nature. I've worked in an African-wide rating agency where everybody's convinced that their country is different, right? And if you break it down to a regional organization in Central Africa, West Africa, the 6 or 8 members will also tell you that they're different. So we need to go past that to some extent and accept that we need a standardized way to look at things. But hopefully there are ways of taking into consideration those differences to the extent that they matter to the outcome.
Thanks, and I think that's very fair. Okay, so we have about 10 minutes left. I want to, there's a great question about Augusto and company and how they can complement the big three. And Sherry mentioned the Africa Credit Rating Agency, which the stakeholders here have engaged with APRM on. But I want to come to this because I think it's an important one, and it's related to one of the calls in the outcome document around national regulatory frameworks. Also to kind of reduce the over reliance on credit ratings. Jacob, can I bring you in just a bit to discuss the to discuss the engagement with APRM in the context of the Africa Credit Rating Agency, and then if anyone has thoughts. I mean, Fabrice, maybe you're well positioned. I'm sure you've worked with the Gusto and Company in the past on how the Africa Credit Rating, independent credit rating agencies, independent of the African Union, can also play a role. But Jacob, first you, and then to Fabrice, and then I'm going to go to Dauda from AfriCatalyst to give us some summarizing thoughts.
Thank you, Rob. The issue of African credit rating agencies is very important, separately from the proposed regional African credit rating agency. There are several working in the field: Bloomfield, Augusto, and others. One has been purchased by Moody's, acquired by Moody's, GCR. And recently in Cape Town, we had both a workshop and the first regional conference on credit ratings focused on ratings for domestic capital. And one of the issues highlighted there is that the role of the African credit rating agencies, including the small ones that exist now, is not just to give more context on the sovereign credit ratings, but they also rate things that the global rating agencies do not. They rate corporate bonds, they rate corporations, they rate municipal bonds, and many other things. So they can help deepen capital markets within countries that the global big three do not look at. Another thing they can do is provide some capacity building as well, because some of them are both advisories and regulators or rating agencies, so they can provide knowledge and technical training to countries. And also they can propose new models. So what they have in their models is different. They have different scales than the global three. So they can provide much more granular information on countries. The other issue is the proposed African Union Credit Rating Agency that's expected to be launched in July. And that can build on what those small agencies are doing by providing this additional information that's not available from the big three, adding regulatory oversight over the activities of rating agencies, and basically helping African countries speak with one voice. Although one challenge that many point out is that, yes, you can create an African rating agency like the European rating agency, but if there's no credibility, the investors won't listen to that. So it's one thing to set it up, and it's one thing to get credibility. And that takes work and consistency in the ratings. So we will see how that works. Thank you.
Thanks. Very, very helpful. Fabrice, any thoughts on this?
I think Jacob summarized the important role of African credit rating agencies in terms of domestic capital market. In terms of sovereign ratings, perhaps they have a bigger role in domestic currency obligations of sovereigns. But the whole conversation about rating agencies, and I think Sherry mentioned also the International Public Rating Agency, it all comes down to investors' acceptance, right? If you issue something, who believes in it, and how credible is that? And there are many things that you need to have in place to achieve that. It's to have a value proposition, the informational value of what you offer, the governance and the methodology, and what is it that you measure, and to some extent there might be room for maybe things that other rating agencies don't do. in terms of information, or what sort of what is it that they're measuring. It all comes down to investor acceptance. How who uses your ratings, who trusts your signal, and that's what makes you relevant.
Thanks. Yeah, and I mean, I think there's some good models globally. I mean, I'm not necessarily an expert in this area, but my understanding is, for example, in Japan, where there's numerous national rating agencies that play very important roles in domestic debt. Okay, great. Well, Dauda, I'm going to turn to you for the next 3 or 4 minutes. If you can give us thoughts, key takeaways. I introduced you at the top. I don't think you had joined us yet, but Dauda Simbene is the CEO of AfriCatalyst, one of our partners on this initiative. Over to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Rob, and good afternoon, everyone. I've been listening with a lot of interest. So if you ask me to come up with some sort of summary or key takeaways, it's going to be extremely hard because the discussion was extremely sort of rich, and the panelists and have done a great job of helping us understand better the issues and how to address those issues. So what I took away, at least from what I heard during the discussion, is, of course, there has been quite an agreement, a broad agreement, that this issue, good credit ratings or improved credit ratings for African countries is a shared responsibilities. It's a responsibility that must be assumed by all the actors. Of course, it includes the credit rating agencies that definitely need to do some better job at making sure that they improve further transparency. They have done some progress on that, and no one would deny that. But I think like Sherry was saying, I think one issue is, of course, to make sure also that you reduce as much as possible the discretion, and to be able to use more sort of model-based sort of ratings. The reality is there is, of course, the methodology that many credit ratings agencies are using, but at the same time, there is also the role of the credit rating committees that sometimes can actually sort of make a decision, not necessarily always on the base of those methodologies. So I think there is some work that needs to be done there from credit rating to do a better job. And I think they all recognize it, and hopefully this is something that they will do. But I think if Africa needs to improve its credit rating, it's not only credit rating that needs to do their job, but also countries themselves and government needs to play their role. And I think panelists have very much agree on that. I think there is definitely scope for pursuing the reform efforts. Othemia and Abed have talked about it. What is being done in Liberia, even though Liberia is not rated, but what is being done also in Tanzania. All those are sort of efforts that must be pursued if African countries wants to be better rated. And on top of the reforms is, of course, making sure that you have the adequate data system, making sure that you also have the strong sort of capacities that are needed. I think Fabrice made a good point of sort of talking about the shortcoming that we still have in terms of understanding the rating process, and being better prepared to the rating, credit rating missions. That's something that definitely we need to do a better job at across the continent. And of course, having a good storytelling, and I would paraphrase Fabrice there, that is supported by evidence. I think this is certainly critical. But at the end of the day, we need all to recognize that credit ratings are not a panacea. And definitely we need to have a more holistic approach that does not only sort of focus on credit rating, but also look at all other factors and issues that are involved, whether we are talking about public investment, the economic governance, the quality and soundness of the policies at the macro level, financial sector. All of that are important issues that needs to be looked at if Africa wants to get sort of a more affordable and adequate access to financing from the global capital market. So I think that's critical. One thing that I would end there, and I definitely very much agree with Sherry. Sherry and I was just on a webinar right before this one, and definitely one thing that was discussed was at the in Seville last week during the Financing for Development, we've seen a lot of credit rating agencies being very, very active, being very sort of involved, like as Sherry said. So it showed that something is working. As she said, I think back after 2008, after the crisis, there was some sort of work that was done, but we never saw them actually as active as now. It means that whatever the organization are doing, the UN, of course, the ACET of this world, Africa Catalyst of the world, but in general, all the advocacy partners that are involved in pushing for this issue are doing a good job that needs to be pursued, that needs to be continued and sustained to keep the pressure and to make sure that the reform are done both at the country level, but also at the credit rating agency level, especially the Big Four, and that's certainly critical. Finally, I think we need we need to have a space for constructive dialogue between all the actors. And I think this is something that some of the panelists mentioned. And it means between the government, between the credit rating agencies, between all the actors that are involved. We very much welcome the efforts at the UN level, particularly at ECOSOC, to really, hopefully, at some point, sort of facilitate that. But beyond also, I think there is scope for organizations like ACET, UNDP, Africa Catalyst, and others to very much play their role and contribute to this type of convening, because that's the best way for all actors to understand each other and see what are the steps that needs to be taken to improve the process much better. And I think that would be critical. Now, last but not least, thank you to all the panelists. Thank you for really making this webinar by UNDP, ACET, and Africa Catalyst very successful, and we all learn a lot, and we definitely look forward to sustaining our engagement with you. And thank you to the audience, both from all over wherever you join us from. And of course, thank you to Ralph, who did a great job of moderating this very fascinating discussion. Thank you very much again, Ralph, and looking forward to continuing this type of efforts with your organizations. Thank you.
Perfectly said, as always. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Take care.